On the afternoon of April 9th, 1892, Nate Champion was holed up in a bullet-riddled cabin. Outnumbered and surrounded, he had been able to hold off his attackers since sunrise. But once they managed to set the cabin on fire, Nate knew he had to act and act fast. He could stay inside and burn to death, or leave and face a small army of 50 paid killers that waited outside. Killers hired by cattle barons to get rid of small ranchers just like Nate. Today's tale is that of an underdog, a true working-class hero. The little guy versus the bully. So saddle up, oil your guns, and get ready to celebrate the life and death of Nate Champion on this open-range episode of Bloody Beaver Podcast. Nate Champion was born in September of 1857 in Leander, Texas, to a family of 18 children. He grew up in the central Texas town of Round Rock. His father was the sheriff of Williamson County, where Round Rock is located, and his Aunt Hattie was a rancher. Evidently one hell of a woman. Hattie drove her own cattle to the market. So right off the bat, we see that Nate comes from a pretty tough stock. He'd go on to become a cowboy, driving cattle from Texas all the way to Kansas at first, but he'd eventually drift up north, working on several ranches before he had enough money saved up to start his own spread. That's the dream, owning your own land and being your own boss. No longer busting your knuckles, make another man rich. Now you're in control of your own destiny. Nate established his ranch in Johnson County, Wyoming. And Johnson County is located in north central Wyoming. In the 1890s, when the bulk of today's tale is going to take place, Johnson County's population was around 2,400 people. And today, the population sits at about 8,500 people. In comparison, just to put a little bit of perspective on it, the population of current-day Williamson County, where Nate was from, is home to over 500,000 people. Overcrowding isn't exactly an issue in Wyoming. To this day, Wyoming remains the least populated state in the United States, even though it's the 10th largest in terms of surface area. Its current population is 570,000 people. There's as many people in the county I reside in as the entire state of Wyoming. So yeah, lots of room to breathe in Wyoming. And not only do you have a lot of room, but it's fucking gorgeous, especially Johnson County. You got the Bighorn Mountains to your northwest and vast, seemingly endless grasslands. This land provided grazing for the buffalo for centuries, and now it's serving as prime cattle grazing country. There's no wonder why so many aspiring ranchers like Nate Champion chose the Johnson County area to put down roots. Fun fact, Fort Phil Kearny, which I discussed on the Fetterman Fight episode, was in present-day Johnson County. So this is land that just 3 decades prior was owned by the Lakota. And Nate wasn't the first cowpoke to graze cattle in that area. Not by a long shot. Nelson Story, remember him from the Lonesome Dove episode? He drove a herd of cattle all the way from Texas to Montana and passed through present-day Johnson County. As things got more settled, many more would follow suit. By the time Nate arrived, lots of enterprising ranchers had already set up shop in this Powder River country. I mean, the Indians were whipped, the buffalo were gone, and the country was theirs for the taking. And some of these ranches had grown hugely successful. And these successful ranchers formed something called the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, holding meetings at the Cheyenne Club in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, by the way, should not be confused with the Wyoming Grower Not a Shower Association. Two very different groups. Just take my word on this one. Let's talk about the Cheyenne Club for a minute. It was an exclusive gentleman's club, and by gentleman's club, I don't mean a titty bar. I mean like a real so-called gentleman. You know, the type of guy that sips champagne with his little pinky finger sticking out. The kind of guys that might, maybe wear a monocle. The club was an opulent 2-story home that included 2 grand staircases, tennis courts, wine vaults, reading, dining, and smoking rooms. Alcohol was prohibited in the reading room, so sorry, no getting drunk reading Charles Dickinson. On the 3rd floor, there were private rooms. And although gambling was forbidden, rumors circulated about high-stakes games in the private rooms. And I can only imagine, every now and then a working gal might just show up in one of those private rooms. Gentlemen in the streets, freak in the sheets. Am I right? Club's membership was limited to 200, and those 200 members were some of the wealthiest ranch owners in the state. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, WSGA for short, was extremely influential when it came to the politics in Wyoming, becoming a very powerful lobbying group. 4 members of the WSGA served in the United States Congress, as well as the majority of Wyoming state legislatures being members of the WSGA. So of course they were instrumental in getting the association's rules and regulations turned into state law. They also didn't take too kindly to these small ranching outfits, like the one Nate Champion just started, taking up land and water resources that these big ranchers considered theirs. There was something called the Homestead Act that became law in Wyoming in 1862. Basically, you find a piece of public land that nobody else is using, you make some improvements on it, even just simply in the form of building a shack, grazing a few animals, and a year later you file on it and it's yours. Congratulations, you now own 160 acres, free and clear. So this made getting land and starting a ranch or a farm or whatever very easy for a working class guy like Nate Champion. But it didn't make the Stock Grower Association very happy when they started seeing all their open range land that, while public domain, they still considered it theirs, being grabbed up by all these nobodies, these non-monocle wearing peasants. So they started making false accusations, very serious false accusations. They accused the small ranchers of rustling their cattle. On July 20th, 1889, 2 small-time operators were lynched by 6 big cattlemen in nearby Carbon County. Not because they were rustlers, but because their homesteads were taking up valuable real estate right smack dab in the middle of all that open range prairie that the cattlemen believed to be theirs and theirs alone. Starting to sound a little bit like that movie Open Range, starring Robert Duvall and Kevin Costner. If you haven't seen it yet, spoiler alert, I'm probably going to be mentioning it more than a few times on this episode. And why haven't you seen it? It ranks up there as one of the top Western movies of all time. And the further I got reading about Nate Champion and the Johnson County War, the more it looks like the movie Open Range may have been loosely based on these events. If you recall, Duvall and Costner weren't setting up a homestead on Open Range, but they were grazing their cattle on it. And that pissed that one rich cattleman off. This is sort of the situation we're talking about in Wyoming on this episode. The cattle barons did not own this open range land. If you wanted to, you could do just what Nate Champion did. Lay claim to some land, start a ranch. It was 100% perfectly legal. We're not talking about squatting or taking something that doesn't belong to you. I want to be clear about that. This land was open to the public. But this infuriated those big ranchers. Like I said, they considered all that open country to be for their use and their use alone. And as it turns out, they were willing to kill to keep it that way. Cheyenne had at this time 2 newspapers. And the big ranchers, of course, owned both papers. So they started spreading all sorts of fake news and out-and-out lies. They painted a picture that the area of Johnson County was full of cattle thieves and killers. They also claimed that the local courts were against them as well, refusing to convict any of these make-believe rustlers. Yeah, well, that's probably because they got arrested on bullshit charges and were actually innocent. And these fake newspaper articles were picked up by other newspapers, even papers back east. So if you weren't a local, you didn't really know what was going on, you'd probably feel sorry for these big ranchers. They're just out there trying to make a living. These asshole thieves keep swooping in, stealing all their cattle. In reality, there was very little cattle rustling going on in the area. The big ranchers were just trying to get the public to sympathize with their cause. And, this way, if some small-time rancher got lynched, they'd sort of have an alibi. You know what? It's just protecting my property. One of the people who got lynched in the 1889 incident I mentioned earlier was a woman named Ellen Watson. The big ranchers had the newspapers report that she was a prostitute who accepted stolen cattle as payment for her services. This, of course, was a lie. I never understood that practice of selling your soul for $1. I got more respect for some of the outlaws I've covered than I do for these big cattle barons. Not only do you murder this lady, but you smear her image, making her out to be some sort of a whore. What does it profit a man to gain the world, yet lose his soul? What are you thinking when you're old and on your deathbed? Man, I sure wish I killed more people for their land so I could have made a few extra dollars. Anyway, things began escalating in Johnson County. And when I say escalating, I mean really fucking escalating. To the point that an assassination squad was formed. And they had a list of 70 targets they intended to murder. This assassination squad, also known as the Invaders, consisted of 23 hired guns from Texas under the leadership of Frank Canton, and close to 30 others who were some of the most powerful cattlemen of Wyoming, as well as their top hands. The group totaled 52 men. These 52 men took a private, because they rich, and very secret train out of Cheyenne before switching to horseback just outside of Casper, Wyoming. And the leader of the Texas gunmen, Frank Canton, is a pretty interesting guy. I'd like to do an episode just on him one day. Canton wasn't his real name. It was actually Josiah Horner. And Mr. Horner began his career as a killer and an outlaw down in Texas. Unlike the men he was about to hunt down and kill, Horner really was a cattle rustler in his younger years. He also robbed banks and once even got into a gunfight with some Buffalo soldiers, wounding one and killing another. Fleeing Texas Rangers in a noose, he headed north and changed his name to Frank Canton. And ironically enough, once in Wyoming, he would go into law enforcement. He served as sheriff of Johnson County, the same county he was now getting ready to invade, for 4 years before it became glaringly obvious that he was paid off by the big cattle outfits. So once again, another open range reference. Just like that town marshal in Open Range who was bought and paid for by that big rancher, Frank Canton was basically the same way. At the time of the Johnson County War, he was no longer sheriff, but he was employed by the Wyoming Stock Growers Association as a range detective, aka hired enforcer. Frank had some of his Texas assassins hang a horse trader by the name of Tom Wagoner. The next name up was Nate Champion. And Nate was a particularly annoying pain in the ass for these cattle barons. He formed his own version of the WSGA, calling it the Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association. He helped organize his own roundups with all the small ranches. He wouldn't be intimidated. He'd already been warned about grazing his cattle on public land, but he kept on doing it. insisting that he and the other small ranchers had as much right to that land as the big ranchers did. Nate was dubbed King of the Cattle Rustlers by those newspapers that were owned by the cattle barons. Hashtag fake news. There's exactly zero evidence that Nate ever stole any cattle. He wasn't even brought up on charges at any point. It was all bullshit. Nate refused to back down, so now they're going to make him pay. Little did they know that making Nate Champion pay wouldn't be as easy as they thought. In the early morning hours of November 1st, 1891, 5 hired killers forced their way into Nate's cabin, guns drawn. Champion reached under a pillow, pulled his own pistol out, and both parties started shooting at almost point-blank range. Nate wounded one of the men in the arm and gut-shot another, a wound that would prove to be fatal. The hit team fled, and miraculously, Nate Champion suffered no wounds, except for a powder burn on his face. So did Nate now get the message and flee the territory? I mean, I think a lot of people would. At this point, he had to know that cattle barons would take any and all measures to keep all that public grazing land to themselves. But Champion wouldn't run. There's that great scene in Open Range when Kevin Costner is listening to the townspeople bitch about how the big rancher had control over everything, and oh, it's a shame what this town's come to. And Kevin Costner's character mentions that they could do something about it. And the townspeople were kind of taken aback at this notion. One of them was like, do something? I'm a freighter. Ralph over there runs a general store. I didn't raise my sons just to see him get killed. And then Kevin Costner's character replies, you may not know this, but there's things that gnaw at a man worse than dying. I'm going to say it again for the people in the back. Watch Open Range if you haven't already. Matter of fact, buy the DVD. It's kind of like Tombstone in the sense you'll want to rewatch it like once or twice a year. There's things that gnaw at a man worse than dying. I could do an entire podcast episode on just that line. I know I've personally done things in the past that gnaw at me. That gnaw on how I view myself as a man. You know, we all want to be heroes. Everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. And I think what Kevin Costner's character is trying to convey here is that there's things a man can do or not do that make it real hard to look at yourself in the mirror afterwards. Regret and shame are motherfuckers. And there are some things worth dying for. In the case of Nate Champion, standing up against these powerful cattle barons was one of those things. Sure, he could have tucked tail and ran, started over somewhere else. Maybe one day get married, start a family, live to be an old man. Every fucking day, something in the back of his mind would remind him that he backed down and didn't stand up for himself. But as it turns out, Nate didn't have any backup in him. Matter of fact, he brought charges against his attackers. He was able to recognize one of the men, and the guy was put on trial for attempted murder, a trial in which Nate would testify. During an investigation, one of the members of the hit squad was forced to admit the names of the other members to 2 witnesses. Those 2 witnesses were both assassinated shortly thereafter. The last thing the cattle barons needed was somebody naming names. These motherfuckers are starting to sound a lot more like a mafia than cattle ranchers. They controlled the politicians and judges. They killed witnesses. Speaking of the mafia, I just watched The Irishman on Netflix. Another good movie. I guess this episode should be called Josh Bores You with Movie Recommendations. But come on, Joe Pesci, Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, it's a winning combo. And now, I can't help imagining those 3 guys dressed up in chaps and cowboy hats, riding around the Wyoming prairie whacking cowboys for the big ranchers. Something like a combination of Goodfellas and Blazing Saddles. Let's get that movie made. Anyway, so now that one of Nate's would-be assassins is on trial, there's a possibility the man could reveal the names of his bosses. And this could result in some of them being charged and sent to prison. The bosses can't have this shit. So they did the logical thing and decided to invade Johnson County. Before moving in on the town of Buffalo, Wyoming, they figured they'd go ahead and take care of that pesky Nate Champion problem. And this time, instead of coming at him with 5 hired killers, they'd bring 10 times that amount. And once again, they caught up with him just as he was waking up in a tiny cabin. It was him and another cowboy by the name of Nick Ray, and 2 trappers they had just been passing through. The 2 trappers weren't on the hit list, so lucky for them, they were just captured and told to get the hell out and keep your mouth shut. Nick Ray wasn't so lucky. When he stepped out of the cabin, the invaders opened fire, mortally wounding the man. Champion immediately appeared at the door, braving a hell of gunfire, and was able to pull his wounded buddy back inside the cabin. The siege was on. Nate was surrounded and outnumbered 50-1. They riddled the cabin with bullets but didn't dare try to charge. Nate had already proven his grit. Matter of fact, his bullets would find at least 3 men during this siege. I'm not sure how large the cabin was. I doubt it was very big. Probably just a 1 or 2 room line shack. No running water, probably a stove, a small table, a few bunk beds. Not sure how many supplies Nate would have had in there with him. Maybe with some water, ample ammunition, some beans and biscuits. Maybe he could have made a stand of it. But he couldn't have lasted for long. These attackers easily could have waited Nate out. Until he ran out of food and water or ammo. But no, these killers had a schedule to keep. Plenty more people other than Nate needed killing that day. And the siege would last most of the day. A day they would see thousands of rounds pumped into the cabin. Imagine how Nate must have felt. His buddy's laying there dying and he can't do shit about it. Gotta constantly stay on alert to make sure the invaders don't just rush the cabin. But at the same time, you got to keep your head down. And the crazy thing here is, we don't have to completely rely on imagination to know what was going on through Nate Champion's mind. Because during the siege, this badass kept a journal of the events. That's right, a journal, not a diary. Guys don't keep diaries, we keep journals. The first entry, written by pencil, states, "Me and Nick Ray was getting breakfast when the attack took place." He then wrote of his dying friend, "Nick is shot but not dead yet. I must go wait on him." Sadly, there was probably only so much that Nate could do for the man, other than try to make him as comfortable as possible, maybe cover him with a blanket, prop his head up. Man, I hope he had some water in the cabin to give to him, just something to comfort him. It wouldn't be much later when Nate would write, "Nick is dead. He died about 9 o'clock. At another point he wrote, "They are still shooting all around the house, boys. There is bullets coming in like hell." And that's H-A-I-L. I can't imagine how many bullets are being shot into that cabin. And here's another thing to keep in mind. The men that surround the house, some of them were genuine killers, like Frank Canton, men who had led violent lives. Nate wasn't like them. He was just a working man. But sometimes when you back a normal guy up against the wall, they fucking fight back. Nate wouldn't surrender. I mean, hell, he couldn't. If he surrendered, they'd string him up. He knew what little chance he had would be once the sun went down. Maybe if he was lucky, he could make a run for it under the cover of darkness. But in the meantime, he kept a sharp vigil. At one point he wrote, "I don't think they intend to let me away this time. Boys, I feel pretty lonesome just now. I wish there was someone with me so we could watch all sides at once. It don't look as if there's much show of me getting away." And then around 4 p.m., Nate wrote, "Well, they have just got through shelling the house like hell. I guess they're going to fire the house tonight. I think I'll make a break when night comes, if alive." Unfortunately for Nate, these pieces of shit wouldn't wait until night. The invaders got a wagon and filled it full of hay and pine poles, setting it on fire and using it like a shield. They ran the blazing wagon into the wall of the cabin. And it didn't take long before the entire cabin was covered in flames, smoke billowing out of the windows. The courageous Nate Champion took this time to write his final journal entry. "The house is all fired. Goodbye, boys, if I never see you again." Signed, Nate D. Champion. He folded up the journal and stuffed it in his pockets. The attackers outside waited as the cabin burned, probably hoping that Nate would succumb to the smoke and flames. But he didn't. Now, I'm pretty sure they about shit themselves when the cabin door swung open and out came Nate Champion. Rifle in hand, Colt revolver shoved under his waistband. Nate came out firing and angled toward a nearby ravine. He knew that was his only hope. Hit that ravine, lay low, escape, and evade. Unfortunately, the assassins had anticipated such an event. These were seasoned killers. They had stationed 6 men in that ravine. Champion was able to get one final shot out of his rifle before he fell in a hell of gunfire. He held off 50 men for an entire day, holed up in a tiny cabin with the bloated body of his dead friend just feet away from him. Probably aching for a drink of water, ears ringing from gunfire, lungs burning with smoke. And he still made it out of that cabin with fight left in him, only to finally meet his demise. Nate Champion died well. Even his attackers agreed, grudgingly at least. One of the leaders said he came out fighting and died game. But assholes will be assholes. They still pinned a piece of paper to Nate's chest that read, "Cattle thieves beware." A reporter that accompanied the invaders would find the bloodstained journal in Nate's pocket. So thankfully, we do have that record of his final hours. How crazy is that? They hired 22 assassins from Texas and head to Johnson County with a list of people to flat out murder. And they bring a fucking reporter with them. I guess in this case, all the reporters were in the cattle baron's pockets, so they'd put a little nice spin on everything. But it just goes to show how cocky these robber barons were. They ride into a county with hired killers and a list of people to murder, and they bring along a damn journalist. It's almost like they were so powerful and influential that they knew they couldn't be touched. But more on that in a minute. Nate's day-long stand didn't just cement his legacy in history as a badass, but it also saved lives. This band of killers spent the entire day trying to rub Nate out. This allowed word to spread. Hundreds of pissed-off small ranchers, men just like Nate, assembled in nearby Buffalo, Wyoming, and rode out to meet these invaders. And my, how the turntables do turn. The shoe was now on the other foot. The 50 assassins now found themselves holed up at a ranch, surrounded by 400 angry locals that were tired of the bullshit. What followed was a siege that would last 3 days. On the 3rd day, they got tired of waiting. These were working guys and they had to get back to their ranches. They utilized a wagon, 2 of them actually, to make this weird movable thing they dubbed the Ark of Cover. Just Google it. It's a big, rolling, awkward-looking fortress that they could hide behind. Plan was push it up against the invaders' fortifications and then blow them out with dynamite. Oh heck, things are heating up now. But then the cavalry arrived. Literally. The governor of Wyoming had arranged for troops to be sent in from nearby Fort McKinney. But check this out. The governor knew about the invasion of Johnson County before it ever happened. Governor Amos Barber not only knew about it, but he supported it. He only had the army sent in because he found out his rich pals were in trouble. He was totally on board with them murdering their opponents, but when things got flipped around, he sent in help. He got word all the way to Washington, D.C., to then President Benjamin Harrison, and convinced Harrison that there was armed insurrection taking place. They ended up waking the president up in the middle of the night for this shit. That's how powerful these Wyoming stock grower cocksuckers were. So the army shows up, they stop the locals from slaughtering the invaders, then take the invaders into custody. Yep, finally, justice is about to be served, right? No. Governor Amos Crooked as Shit Barber took over custody of the invaders. He refused to allow the men to be interrogated and just basically fucked up the entire investigation. And because the arrest took place in Johnson County, the county that was full of mostly hard-working, honest, small ranchers, the county these rich cattle barons invaded with their small army of killers, this is the county that had to foot the bill when it came to feeding and housing all the prisoners. They also had to put forth all the money it cost to prepare and present a court case. And this was a poor county. They just couldn't afford it. 8 months later, in a courthouse in Cheyenne, that same Cheyenne that's owned by these cattle barons, all charges against the invaders were dropped. Imagine that. They got off scot-free. They were too powerful to be touched. Unfortunately, that's just how life be sometimes. Sometimes good people like Nate Champion die young and evil people live to a ripe old age. I believe in an afterlife, though. I think we're all going to have to answer for our actions one of these days. Like that great quote from The Gladiator. What we do in life echoes in eternity. And here we are, 128 years later, celebrating the life and brave death of Nate Champion. His bravery echoes through the years. And the corruption and douchebaggery of the paid killers and rich cattle barons does too. Unlike Nate, they're not celebrated. Their memory is despised. Frank Canton, leader of the hired killers from Texas, continued to work in law enforcement. He became a U.S. deputy marshal in Oklahoma, kind of like Bass Reeves. And this job allowed him to utilize the whole ramming a burning wagon into a cabin trick again to capture a couple outlaws. He'd eventually become the adjutant general of the Oklahoma National Guard. But I guess as he got older, maybe his conscience started to gnaw at him. He voluntarily turned himself into authorities in Texas and confessed to his true identity, the outlaw Josiah Horner. But he was granted a full pardon due to his history of law enforcement and continued to live under the alias Frank Canton for the rest of his life, finally dying in 1927 at the age of 78. If he hadn't helped kill Nate Champion, Nate might have still been alive in 1927. He'd have been 70. Wonder if Canton ever thought about Nate in his final years. Wonder if he ever regretted killing a good man. All in all, the common people of Wyoming were outraged at what took place in Johnson County. And they weren't happy with all these corrupt politicians and cattle barons running their state. So they took to the polls and sent a strong message during the 1892 elections. A lot of incumbents lost their positions of power. Eventually, the Stock Growers Association had to open up their books to the small-time ranchers. The association is actually still around today. According to them, nowadays they're focused on advocating issues affecting the cattle industry, Wyoming agriculture, and rural community living, as well as providing members with timely information regarding events in the cattle industry and the activities of the association. They also promote the role of the Wyoming cattle industry in resource stewardship, animal care, and the production of high-quality, safe, and nutritious beef. So, not hiring any more small armies of assassins to do your bidding anymore. So that's good. Step in the right direction. The violence didn't just stop completely, though. You still see instances of cattle barons killing small ranchers every now and then following Nate Champion's death. As late as 1909, a group of rich cattlemen killed some sheep herders, along with their damn sheep. Why you gotta kill the sheep? But this time, justice was served. The killers were arrested, convicted, found guilty, and sent to the state prison. There's still plenty of public land available in Wyoming for everyone to enjoy, rich or poor. According to BLM.org, there's currently 18.4 million acres of public land in Wyoming. BLM, by the way, stands for the Bureau of Land Management. Where I'm at here in Texas, there's no BLM land, unfortunately, but there's plenty out west, states like Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, Montana, Idaho, Colorado, Oregon, etc. This land is for the people, free to use for hunting and fishing and camping and all other sorts of outdoor recreation. And just like in Nate Champion's day, ranchers still graze their cattle on these public lands. Okay, I guess that's about it. Kind of a short episode. I'm still toying around with how long to make these. No real updates this episode. I do have 2 interviews set up that I'll hopefully be able to do this month, so fingers crossed that it actually happens. It'd be nice to talk to some real historians and experts every now and then, just to counterbalance out all of my complete and utter ignorance. Oh, I do have an update. On my Quanah Parker episode, one of the sources I used was a book called Empire of the Summer Moon. Well, just last night I listened to an interview with the book's author, S.C. Gwynn, in which he let it slide that the script has already been written and a movie is in the works. Man, I hope that happens. I know projects like this die on the vine all the time in Hollywood, but I really think his book would make an awesome movie. Wish they'd have made that movie instead of Hostiles. I was really disappointed with Hostiles. The cast was great. Wes Studi, the actor that portrayed that Cheyenne chief, he would have made a great Quanah Parker. And Christian Bale would have been perfect as Mackenzie. Anyway, hopefully this movie gets made. I highly recommend that book, Empire of the Summer Moon. Not sure what my next topic's going to be on. If you have any suggestions, email me at bloodybeaverpodcast@gmail.com. Definitely not running out of topics, though. I keep an ever-growing list. Just picking some randomly. We've got the Mountain Man Jim Bridger, Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce, the Outlaw Sam Bass. I want to do one on the Texas Ranger known as Bigfoot Wallace, Deacon Jim Miller and Clay Allison, both of whom sent many, many men to their graves. There's a guy named Soapy Smith. He was an Old West con man. If you've ever seen Deadwood, you remember those scenes that had that guy yelling about soap? Soap with a prize inside. That's based on Soapy Smith. I want to talk about Moses Rose, the man that fled the Alamo. Speaking of the Alamo, I'm definitely doing an episode on Davy Crockett, but I want to be very thorough on Davy. I got to read a few books first. And I want to get to the bottom of how he died. Did he really go down swinging old Betsy? Or, was he taken alive and executed? I want to do an episode on the massacre of Wounded Knee, and that might be next week. I've been itching to do that one. Then there's another mountain man named Jim Beckworth who was born a slave. And speaking of slaves, I want to talk about York, that slave that I mentioned in my John Coulter episode. If you remembered, York was owned by Captain Clark and accompanied the Corps of Discovery all the way to the West Coast and back. What happened to him after the expedition? Was he freed? There's some interesting stuff in there. And what happened to Sacagawea after the expedition? Did she die young, or did she return to her Shoshone people and live almost to be 100 years old? And what happened to little Pomp, the baby she gave birth to during the trip? A lot of topics. I want to do them all. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you keep listening. I do want to touch on something real quick that I touched on in my episode on the James Younger gang. My dirty potty mouth. I'm just going to say this, and that'll be the end of it. I got another comment on my profanity, specifically about the episode I did on John Coulter. And the comment kind of cracked me up, honestly. They said, quote, wow, ... space. Don't know why they put that little space after the dots. They said, profanity does not make sound smart, ... space, next video. No punctuation at the end, so I'm assuming she meant next video. Or maybe it could have been a question, like Ron Burgundy style. Next video? I did touch briefly on this before. Basically, I'm going to talk how I'm going to talk. I'm trying to cover these topics in a semi-hopefully entertaining fashion, and I don't want it to be all stuffy, like you're getting a lecture from a professor or some shit. I don't mind comments like this. It keeps me in check and makes me hope that I'm not coming off like some teenager that just learned how to cuss. Every word just fuckity fuck. Maybe I should watch my mouth. I don't want anything to distract from the stories I'm telling, but I also want to keep things casual and entertaining. All that said, I'm a strong believer in the First Amendment. I am an American. And here in America, we have the natural God-given right of free speech. Forrest Gump didn't take a bullet in the ass in Vietnam just to see an infringement on my God-given rights. You think John Wayne died at the Alamo just so you could try to silence me? Mel Gibson didn't go to war with England just to have some sensitive Nancy complain about the kind of words he used. You really think Tom Hanks stormed the beaches of Normandy and got killed trying to save Matt Damon's ass just so you can get on YouTube and bitch and moan about everything? No! Stand up and salute the damn flag. Tony Montana didn't come all the way over here from Cuba just to have someone tell him how he couldn't talk a certain way. God bless America and our right to say whatever we want. I may not like what you have to say, you may not like what I have to say, but I'll defend your right to say it. So get off Facebook, get off YouTube, stop complaining, and start enjoying your life. Fuck my podcast, go pet a kitten or hug somebody. Give someone a compliment. While you're doing it, enjoy your right to say whatever the fuck you want to say. That's right. God bless the USA. And with that, I'm out. Thanks for listening. As always, thanks for all of the comments. If you don't hear from me before Christmas, have a Merry Christmas. Hope you don't get any coals in your stocking. Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, happy whatever weird holiday you're celebrating. Don't let any cattle barons try to force you off your land. Don't let anybody force anything on you. Stand up, gird your loins, and give it right back to them, just like Nick Champion did.